everybody for coming at relatively short notice. We wanted to do a public event on the momentous referendum result of how long ago? A week? 10 days. And we assembled at short notice a good bunch of people to talk for 6 or 7 minutes each about what's happened. We want to look back, we want to see what the referendum result reveals to us about our country, the regional class value divides that have been exposed, and we want to think about that. We also want to think about the future, how these two political tribes can be reunited in some form, whether we already have basis for new political parties indeed amongst the remainders and leaders. Anyway, we will get going. I won't have a long introduction, but just very briefly, on my far left is Corey Duffy, who is going to start. He is one of the brainy analytical pollsters. He's at IPSOS-MORI. To my left is Eric Kaufmann, Professor Kaufmann, who is a political scientist who studies ethnicity and nationality. He's written very interestingly on white flight, amongst other things. To my immediate right is Matthew Goodwin, Professor Matthew Goodwin, Kent University, who is the co-author of the book about UKIP. And I don't think you can really claim to have invented the phrase left behinders. It's sort of slightly too generic. Nonetheless, I think you sort of claimed it as your own for the last few years. And on my far right is Suella Fernandes, who is the Conservative MP for Fareham in Portsmouth, and was a Brexiter herself, is a Brexiter herself, as was Fareham, by 55 to 45%. So everybody will speak for a few minutes, and then we'll have to speak amongst themselves for a few minutes, and then we will have a public discussion. So, Bobby first, please.
Okay, thanks very much, David. Now, we're not going to talk too much about the points, we can get into that in discussion. I'll just gloss over that for now. But what I'm going to talk about instead is a little bit about the narrative about why we saw Remain lose, and it's much so to think about the expectation that economic concerns would trump immigration and sovereignty. But that's maybe the reason behind the surprise, at least. It's not the main reason why we had the weak outcome we had. But the argument about the long-term because of the economic impact was far from one priority, and that's one of the key things that the polling shows throughout, is that wasn't the pattern we saw. So Britain's economy over the next 5 years, we asked people about that. It's true that half of people thought it would be worse over the next 5 years if Britain were to leave. But 26% thought it would be better, which is by no means a clear-cut view that the economy would actually get worse with Exit. Over the next 10 to 20 years, slightly longer term view, it's actually more people saying that the economy would get better rather than worse. And then the crucial one at the bottom, your own standard of living. True, again, 3 in 10 people thought their own standard of living would get worse, but 2 in 10 thought it would get better. So there was no clear-cut sense which that economic message landed for among voters. And more generally, the Leave campaign messages were just more believed, and that sense of risks in the status quo being as high as risks in leaving was strong among people. So people believed, much more likely to believe, that we would end up paying billions of pounds to do bailouts to banks if we stayed in the EU. So half of people believe that, so 4% didn't believe it. And then the 350 million message was quite incredible. It had an incredible campaign reach. It was 8 in 10 people had seen that as a message at some point during the campaign, and 47% of people believed it, 38% of people didn't. 45% of people thought that Turkey would be fast-tracked into the EU, completely split the population. And then again, at the bottom there, if Britain votes to leave, that we would lose £4,300 per year as individual households. Only 17% of people believe that, 7% of people thought that was true. So no sense of which those types of messages landing with people from an economic point of view. And that's obviously what people are saying. And people can post-rationalise what they say in these. So we try to use different techniques to get at what underlying attitudes were. And this is something called implicit reaction times, where it doesn't just ask people what they think, it measures how long they take to respond. And this has been validated as a method in lots of different situations, where actually your speed of response is a much better indication of how strongly you believe something. And this was something underneath the data that we had seen at the time. And the key one from that was, of course, Remain voters said that staying in was better for the economy, and they also really believed it. They kind of owned that. But Leave voters were exactly the same. They kind of owned it too. So this wasn't just them rationalising it, it was a true belief that staying and leaving is just as good for the economy as staying in. So it was more emotional than we thought maybe. Hugo Young wrote in this blessed plot in 1998 that our attitudes to Europe were, what was it, ignorant, half-hearted and changeable. How true. And I think it probably was true. I guess he wrote that in 1998, and I think since then our attitudes to Europe have been tied up with so many other things about being left behind, as Matthew was talking about, but also immigration in particular. It's not half-hearted. And Daniel Kahneman, the godfather of behavioural science, commenting, lots of people commented on the EU referendum. People came in and all had their views, but Daniel Kahneman we should listen to. He was talking about this being about irritation and anger, that may lead to Brexit, but the emotional reaction in this is much more important. The major impression he got was observing the debate was that the reason for exit are clearly emotional. So that sense of emotional but not necessarily a rational response is, I think, very, very important. And it's part of two main deeper underlying trends that we're seeing, which I'm sure we'll pick up on, and they're competing. But the first point to make is we shouldn't expect buyers' regret from this. These are quite deep-held feelings among different sections of the population, and you shouldn't expect buyers' regret from it. I think that was the initial reaction, was actually people are going, once they realise what they've done with this exit vote, they are going to regret it. It's very easy to find people that are travelling away on their holidays at airports, and you can interview and say they misunderstood, but that is not the underlying trend in this. You see this, we did this poll from Newsnight that we released on Friday, where it's split, the population is still split on whether it was the right decision or the wrong decision. 44% saying it was the wrong decision, 43% saying it was the right decision. That was entirely split by how people had voted in the referendum. So Leave voters 9 and 10 said it was the right decision, Remain voters 9 and 10 said it was the wrong decision. So now in that sense, you're not seeing this quick turnaround, you're definitely not seeing this quick turnaround in buyers' regret from this decision. And that's because it's part of these broader trends, deep-seated broader trends. And this is Pippa Norris talking about the situation in Western democracies generally, that it's authoritarian populism is rising across the West, all sorts of reasons for it. The economy and inequality is certainly part of that in Pippa's view, but she's saying that much more important than that is a backlash against too fast cultural change. So this is partly about that inequality being left behind. There's also that sense of cultural change that's happening too quickly for people to be comfortable with, or a large proportion of the population to be comfortable with. And in certain countries, like the US and the UK, that has a strong focus on immigration as a cause of that. Immigration is tied up with that sense of cultural change being too quick. And you can see that from our analysis that we did. Our US colleagues did some analysis on what was driving Trump's popularity in the primaries, and they put it into all sorts of different models, standard regression models. These are Bayesian net models, network models, and put all the different factors that you could think of that may be driving that come up commonly, whether it's a sense of the end of the American dream, whether it's you're going to be worse off than your parents, and systems broken, anti-big government, abortion, lots of different types of issues. But by far, the biggest driver in all the different models that they developed was a sense of nativism, a growing sense of nativism and anti-immigration within the US. That predated with bigger than any of these other drivers of support for Trump. So a key aspect of it, and then the reaction to that is, as David said in his Times article, that does point to a very simple fact that you need to deal with immigration in some sense for people if you want to deal with this as an issue. Control is important, and David's suggestions around department that deals with this exclusively, and greater resources for our border control, even in the time between now and the settlement with Europe. And then, crucially, money for local impact. We did a massive review of attitudes to immigration a couple of years ago, and what that showed was people were perfectly rational in their economic assessment of the impact of immigration, because they may well accept that the net macroeconomic benefit of immigration is a net positive for the country as a whole. They don't see that. People don't see that. All they see is the increasing pressure in local services and in local job markets. That's what they see, that's what they experience. They don't see the macro benefit. So money, we've been very remiss in putting money to control for local impact. And then finally, we've got this counter trend among young people in particular. This is generation analysis that we've done. Big generational theme that we've got across lots of different issues, because there is big differences between the generations on lots of different aspects. This is trust in the European Union. The line in red is Generation Y, so the current youngest generation, and it goes down generation after generation down to the pre-war generation of baby boomers in yellow and grey at the bottom. So this is a pattern we see time and again. So twice the level of trust in Generation Y in the European Union than you see in baby boomers in the pre-war generation. They're also twice as likely to vote to remain as leave. They're half the level of concern about immigration. And the key thing about looking at this generationally rather than by age is this is tracking them over time. This is a cohort moving through time, and they're staying more open towards Europe over time. They're quite old now, some of these Gen Y, 35-year-olds at the end of this run here. But they're keeping those attitudes with them. It's not something that's shifting as they age.
But they're responding to events as well, aren't they? They're responding to financial crisis.
Absolutely. But the gap between Gen Y and Gen X is staying the same. So everyone's changing. We've got period, cohort, and life cycle effect going on here. So everyone is changing. There's a period effect around the crisis, but then trust comes back. But the gap is the thing you need to look at. They're staying more trusting in European Union, so they're going to keep that with them, and that is a real issue for this, because this generation in red is growing at 1.5% of the population each year. They're making up 1.5% more of the population each year. Those ones at the bottom are making up 1.5% less of the population each year as they die out. So we are having a shift, an inexorable shift towards this more open view. But it's going to be slow, but it's almost inevitable. So the 48% will slowly but inevitably grow. And actually feels very dangerous and uncomfortable right now, but it's going to get worse in some senses, because these are going to be bigger. Things are going to have to change to compensate for the people who feel left behind. But these people, this group will be the population are the ones that are going to have to watch for the future. Thank you.
Great.
Yes. Okay, so the theme of this talk is Brexit is not the economy, stupid. And Bobby did such a sort of nuanced job, but really this was partly speaking to the narrative that's emerged in the media that's focusing on haves versus have-nots, London versus provincial England as being the real divide. I want to suggest that those things are almost meaningless, not totally meaningless, but relatively meaningless when it comes to explaining the Brexit vote. Now, you aren't going to have to put up with any more census slides, so just ask you to bear with me. Now, these two are going to speak off the cuff. But in any case, I want to look at a lot of the data that I'm going to be looking at is from the British Election Study, which is a rolling panel survey of about 24,000 people. This is from prior to the Brexit vote, but the patterns that I'm going to show you have not changed very much. And in fact, if you look at the Ashcroft polling and the demographics, they more or less match what we've got here. So I think I'm speaking roughly the truth. And I want to particularly emphasize personality. Now, what have I done here? Essentially, I've said, okay, let's take maybe 1,000 people, and if we have to predict which way those people are going to vote, and we have no information on whether they voted Brexit or otherwise, if we just go with a guess, we're going to get 50% of those correctly classified. So just chance alone will give us 50% because there's only two options, in or out. Now, if we add in the economic variables and we know people's income and we know their class position, that increases our score to about 55%. So it does give us something. The economics gives us a little bit, but it doesn't give us very much compared to chance. Similarly with region, if we know someone's from London or from Wales or Scotland, it gives us a little bit, but it's pretty small in terms of differentiating whether someone's a Brexiteer or whether they are in favor of Remain. And that's partly why I'm arguing that the economic factors here are not particularly important. Region is not particularly important. And yet that's what we've been hearing in the media a lot. London versus provinces, the have-nots versus the haves. And I know Matt didn't mean, when he used the term left behind, he didn't mean economic left behind, but that's the way the media has really spun this. I think they kind of distorted his message, actually. Age and education are more important than income and class, and they're tied more to people's identity. So it's really about identity and not about material interests. So how old you are or how educated you are is tied much more closely to your identity. And there we see that if you know people's ages and educations, you get to sort of over 60% correctly classified. And that means this is a more important way of thinking about the drivers of Brexit. But it's still limited. Part of what I'm arguing is that group differences between age, education, even ethnicity only take us that far. We've got to start looking within group at the psychology, the values, the almost hardwired differences between, crudely put, open and closed types of personality. And that conditions people's attitudes on a whole range of things. Now, if you know somebody's position on a 10-point left-right scale, you can get up to about 65% correctly classified. If you know whether they voted UKIP or Labour or Tories or what other party they voted for, you're over 70%. Similarly, if you know their position, their attitude to immigration on a 10-point scale, that also gives you a 70%, over 70% correct classification. And finally, this question, do you think European unification has gone too far? Yes, or it hasn't gone far enough. If you know that answer, you're at almost 80%, which is more or less a very similar question almost to the Brexit question, as if you throw in a bit of risk appetite. And that suggests something which is, I think, quite interesting. Here's a question on support for the death penalty. Now, no one's been out there campaigning to bring back the death penalty. This isn't an issue of major political consciousness raising, and yet it is as important as immigration, as important as party support in determining its stance on Brexit. Now, what is this telling us? I think if you talk to social psychologists, Bobby alluded to this term authoritarianism, which I don't think is actually a very good term because it's very loaded and very normative, but refers to people who don't like change, who like stability and order rather than novelty, difference, change. And those kinds of people are very much more likely to vote in Brexit. And just to give you another example of this again is from the British election study. The probability of voting to leave the EU was asked in 2015, will you vote to leave the EU? And down here we have, do you think the death penalty is appropriate? 1, no, to 5, yes, I agree strongly in the death penalty being appropriate. And what you see is that for those who are very against the death penalty, only about 20%, there's only a 20% probability that they will vote to leave. Amongst those who strongly agree with the death penalty, it's about 70%. That's a huge gap. It's an enormous gap, as big as almost anything else we can find. Whereas between low and high and middle income, there's nothing. It's essentially nothing. So this idea that it's about the haves and have-nots, it's not. That's got almost nothing to do with what we see in the Brexit vote. Not only that, it is true that income is partly linked to this authoritarianism thing, which has to do with views on the death penalty, sentences for lawbreakers, whether children should obey, and all these kinds of attitudes. But it actually doesn't explain much about authoritarianism. It's largely a personality dimension. It's independent of those demographics. So what I'm trying to say is we partly need to get away from the visible differences between groups, such as the working class and students. Yes, that matters. But more important, about 3 times as important, are the differences, the invisible differences within groups between individuals who might be more authoritarian-minded and perhaps less authoritarian-minded. If you like, it's openness versus order versus openness. That kind of personality dimension is paramount in determining whether you support Brexit, whether you're opposed to immigration, whole series of, including voting for populist-like parties. So we got to get at that authoritarianism, social psychological dimension. Similarly, Islington, which you might recognize, you could sit there and you could say, well, Islington, that's a Remain community, and Boston and Lincolnshire is a Leave community. But the kind of differences I'm talking about really cut through not only communities, but also between families. So these are differences within, not differences between, and I think those haven't received anywhere near as much attention as they deserve. So it's the differences that divide communities. Boston, like London, is a divided community. Almost 40% of London voted to leave. So this idea that London is somehow Remain is, I think, a misnomer. It's because our minds are tuned up to think in terms of the categories: region, age, education, class. But that can be misleading. The invisible differences within are very important. Now, there's a question on the British Values Survey which asks, should sex offenders be publicly whipped or worse? And if you ask the question, the EU has a very detrimental effect on society. Those who strongly disagree that sex offenders should be whipped in public, of course, there's almost none of them that say that the EU has a very detrimental effect. Those who say they should be, very strong effect. Keeping that in your mind, I just want to move to, and this comes from Pat Day's work with the British Values Survey. So this question on whipped, should criminals, sex criminals be whipped, lights up on this map because it's very highly correlated with hardcore negative opposition to EU membership. You see a whole series of different personality or values dimensions which cluster in this broad region. This third of the quadrant here is characterized by people who don't like change, who prefer order, stability, clarity, certainty. And that's very different from these people here, in particular, who are characterized by openness, and it's a big 5 personality dimension, who are very into novelty, adventure, stimulation, and so forth. And these people here who are about hedonism, visible success, achievement, spender, etc. So there are these, I think, quite important differences which tend to cluster. And you'll see a similar map when you go to different countries. You'll see a similar map when it comes to immigration. So the question then becomes, I'm arguing that these people are almost hardwired to be opposed to change. And so they're not going to respond to building schools in areas where immigrants are. Those kinds of policy proposals are not going to do very much. My argument very much is, in order to address their worries, you have to address what's really concerning them, which I would argue is to do with them as an ethnic group. The white British as an ethnic group, and their anxiety about decline. And so you need to start the politicians need to actually connect with them and start to reassure the ethnic majority that actually their identities will continue over time. And that then gets us into a discussion about, should that be then about cutting immigration? It can also be about reassuring them that assimilation is taking place in such a way that their traditions and their identity is not threatened.
Well, thank you, Professor. I get the feeling there are a few people in the audience who are Brexiters who don't think of themselves as whippers or death penalty advocates, but we can hear from you a bit later. Over to you, Professor number 2, Matt.
Thank you very much for coming along. I did have slides, so I was trying to prepare slides, and then Nigel Farage resigned, and one day exploded into my face. So to think about that. Yeah, I mean, what I wanted to say were just a few words about the results. What I think it means for British politics, what it tells us about European politics more generally, and where we might be going from now onwards. It's obviously been a somewhat bizarre 10 days or so, a week in British politics. The morning after the result, a journalist from the Financial Times walked up to me and said, it's been a rather strange day. The Prime Minister resigning is only our 3rd most important story. So after Brexit and the markets crashing, you know, we're not even talking about Cameron's legacy yet, but I'm sure we will do. The sort of brief version of the story that I want to tell starts about 2 years ago when we published a book called Revolt on the Right, and we essentially argued that there are large sections of the British population who were growing increasingly resentful toward the political elite, and who were either abandoning mainstream politics or turning to the UK Independence Party because of a cluster of reasons. Economically, they were in a marginal position, but they also held a very different set of values. And primarily, they were anxious about cultural factors, worried about the effects of immigration, Britain's EU membership, but more, I think, than that, also worried about a lack of responsiveness or perceived responsiveness in Westminster. And if you look at a very simple question that the British Social Attitude Survey asks, and has asked for many years, do you feel represented by the government? Do you feel that politics essentially is representing you? The percentage of working class voters who now say, actually, I don't feel represented, is now at a record high. It hit that high just shortly, basically coinciding with the rise of Nigel Farage and UKIP. And like him or loathe him, Farage realised very early on that there was a significant degree of potential among those more northern Labour heartlands and the east coast of England, out of London, and in more recent years in areas of Wales, where of course we saw early this year the results of that strategy. In a way, after all of that, the result of the referendum should not have been a surprise. And I'm surprised by the extent to which people are surprised. I keep getting calls from journalists, and I talk to friends in the city, and they say, well, surely this is shocking, we thought Remain was going to win. If you've been watching British politics closely, and you've been seeing the general erosion of public support for the main parties, and the creeping resonance of those cultural appeals, then the events of the 23rd of June should not at all have been a surprise. Nor should the majority vote of well over 60% for Brexit across a large swathe of Labour territory, running from Merthyr Tydfil right up to Gateshead and Sunderland, because we've long known that that voter angst was there. And I think more than that, we've known across Europe that essentially the sort of underlying foundations of politics are changing. And I'm going to push the limits a little bit and maybe take off my formal research hat and just speculate a little bit before Eric jumps on me. But it's almost cliche to say, politics isn't left and right anymore. But there is now a growing amount of evidence to suggest that the old left-right Labour capital division is increasingly making way for a new division in politics that is between liberals and authoritarians, or in more general terms, is a new cultural cleavage between those who are not making any value judgments, those who support EU, things like EU integration and immigration and so on, and those who feel uncomfortable with that. And that cultural cleavage is primarily behind a lot of the volatility that we see across most of Western Europe. It's behind the rise of Eurosceptic parties and anti-establishment parties that almost always pick up their votes from the same demographics, the same social groups in society. People who feel that they're not adequately represented, and in many cases they're not. People who feel profoundly unsettled by rapid social change, for good reason, in some cases. That the sort of implication of that research and evidence is essentially that this isn't just about the referendum, and this isn't going away. And in particular, I think it carries resonance for centre-left parties and social democrats who have profoundly misjudged that current and have failed to speak convincingly to those concerns over identity and culture. And they've tried to speak to that instead in a language that is, as you would sort of expect from a social democracy point of view, a language that is intrinsically economic, that is resource-based, that is about jobs and zero-hours contracts and wages, which has completely not connected with, has not reflected the kind of conversation that these particular groups of voters want to have. And that's why Labour is in particular problems but why Holland and many other socialists in other European states are also facing big problems, because their electorates are no longer coherent, and they are divided very strongly, and will be divided increasingly so, between essentially a more economically prosperous middle class that is fairly comfortable with some of those social and economic changes, and an economically disaffected working class, lower middle class, and also self-employed workers who don't feel connected. So it's very, I struggle to see how Social Democrats will reconcile that tension going forward, and it may be that they have to embark on wholesale change if they are to actually put together something viable over the longer term. Where are we going now, post the referendum result? I think the Conservative Party has a unique, has a great opportunity to recast, the right, if you like, or conservative politics in a way that does speak clearly and compellingly to groups who, have taken, this one opportunity outside of first past the post, outside of the majoritarian system, to have their views expressed. I think the Conservative Party is well placed to speak to those groups, provided that it does so in a conversation that perhaps is more about identity and belonging, and less about transactional politics. And I think the coming direct today from the other side of that divide, the Eurosceptic and UKIP side of that divide, I think the Conservative Party will also have greater room for manoeuvre given the growing interest on the Eurosceptic fringe, and likely the UKIP Eurosceptic fringe, in the Labour areas rather than the Conservative areas. The conversations today among those who would look to succeed Nigel Farage were completely dominated by discussions of Labour constituencies rather than Conservative constituencies. And I think among that particular group in British politics, I think there is a genuine sense of excitement about the potential for gains in areas like Wales and North East and North West, by offering something that is fairly narrowly focused around migration and trying to hold the government to account on the negotiations with Europe. It's going to be very difficult for the Labour Party to respond to that in the short term, given that Jeremy Corbyn, I think it's fair to say, is showing absolutely sort of zero interest in innovating or talking to those voters, largely because of his personal politics. I don't think he can speak to those voters who have moved increasingly to UKIP. And so it leaves British politics in a far more volatile, unpredictable place. And I would push back a little bit against Eric by saying that obviously personality factors and attitudes are very important. But there is a very clear map to the referendum result, very clear divides in that. And I'm intrigued to see the extent to which those can account for some of the personality differences within Britain. I would struggle to see all authoritarians, for example. So we'll talk a little bit about that a bit later. Yeah, but yeah. So in general, I think we're in a more volatile place, a more fragmented place. But none of this was a surprise. I think all of this was quite a long time coming. As we can go into discussion.
Thanks very much. So, it's a great opportunity.
Yes, I echo. I think it is a great opportunity for the Conservative Party and indeed the country. We are at a crossroads, and I think that it's nothing short of a revolution which has occurred by Britain voting to leave the European Union, defying the pollsters, defying the markets. It really revealed a disconnect between London, South, Westminster politicians and the rest of the country. And I think there are three ways of looking at what lies ahead. I think there's a response from the European Union to this decision by the UK to leave. There's a response by the UK at a macro level, and then also at a micro level, and what it means for political parties and individuals. So first of all, I think there are three ways the European Union can respond to the UK's decision. First of all, it can either opt for its familiar response to general crises in the European Union, which is more Europe, further integration, pooling of more sovereignty, and closer collaboration on governance and asylum and immigration. I personally think that in order for the EU to do that and opt for that response, it needs to first of all acknowledge that there is a scale, or the scale of the crisis at the heart of the EU, and develop a dynamic way to fight back against that crisis. And what that simply means is that it needs to provide tangible solutions to a failing currency, to the migration crisis, and to other problems of identity and disillusionment within millions of people within the European Union. I think it needs a new tone to acknowledge that malcontent and to accept that if it's going to proceed down the line and a route of further integration, that needs to be justified and the bar to overcome is higher. The other option for the European Union is to pause and, in acceptance of this huge blow to the project, to accept that actually it needs to retreat from its direction of travel, which is closer and further European integration. I can foresee perhaps a situation where the euro-out countries, Poland and Hungary, will be treated slightly differently to the other countries which are part of the currency. Britain's membership of the European Union provided a strong voice for those countries when it came to negotiating on various ways forward. And I feel that there may well be a fracturing of the different types of countries who are participating. Or a third option is that the European Union could reflect on its lack of popularity and to see that it needs to win over hearts and minds by focusing on what it does do well and minimising its role in the lives of people who are in the European Union. By that I mean that it should aspire to be a free trade zone solely, and without intervening in national budgets, in asylum policy, in legal affairs and fiscal transfers. And that may well be one way to ensure its survival, by paring down its activity. So I believe that one thing the European Union does need to do is take account of the effect of populism, right-wing populism, which is spreading throughout the EU. We've already seen calls for a referendum in France. We've seen the rise of far-right parties in Holland and Austria. And I think that that is a consequence of the failings of the European Union. But they will be ignored at the peril of the European Union. And so it needs, I think, politicians in the major EU countries and leading the European Union need to, they face an option whether they dance to the tune of populists, i.e. talking about immigration and identity in a more stringent way, or whether they ignore that fear which is widespread and continue on regardless. I think this presents an existential dilemma for the European Union. Turning to the UK, I believe that I think this is a great opportunity for the UK. This vote was not just about, I believe, not just about membership of the European Union. I think it was a call for change more fundamentally and profoundly about society and about politics and about life chances to people. I feel that there are, if we're looking at the breakdown of the vote, where it's low-skilled, low-paid areas, people in smaller economies of the heart of the country, where there were high levels of deprivation, and there were high turnouts for voting for leaving the European Union. Again, challenging this left-right notion and the traditional lines of how party political lines are drawn. I think the UK on a macro level needs to make sure that the world knows that it's still open for business, that it's not drawing up the bridge to foreign investment or people coming into this country, that it's still pursuing an economic liberal policy, liberal economic policy, and I think that cutting corporation tax is a very healthy sign that it will be saying to foreign business that you are welcome here, and there is a climate and a framework in which foreign business can flourish. I think that concerns about immigration do need to be tackled head on, and so control of EU migration needs to be made explicit and clear. There needs to be a full and frank debate, as we've heard during the referendum, that people need to engage with. And I think that there also needs to be a points-based system, which is being promoted by many of, I think, all of the leadership candidates now, as to how they would implement that control over migration. By not, leaving the European Union does not mean leaving Europe, and I think we can make symbolic and very important take stances which show that that is the case. For example, ensuring that we carry on our trade with countries in the European Union, supporting a NATO base in Poland, for example, and also ensuring that negotiations and trading links are reinforced. Turning to the micro and the impact on us as individuals and political parties, I think what was astonishing about the European the referendum is that for individuals calling for this change, as I said, it goes deeper than just a question of our relationship with the European Union. People want more connection to those who are making decisions and ruling us. They want more opportunity, they want to feel more empowered, and they want to feel like they have a chance at owning a home, at saving some money, and at having stability in their life as they go through it. And I feel that there's a division between those who are reaping the benefits of globalisation and those who are left behind, and that's been reflected by the vote. The excesses at the top of big businesses, the sense that there are a minority of privileged people who are exploiting tax systems, the sense that there is a block to breaking through into markets and diversifying and starting a business, or a sense also that our public sector, bloated and inefficient as it is, that stifles passion and vocation. Teachers, people who work in hospitals feel weighed down by bureaucracy, and as if they are treading water, and as if they cannot quite achieve what they set out to do. I think all of those factors make for unease and have contributed to the vote, and policymakers within the Conservative Party and the government need to respond to that creatively. And lastly, I would just say that I think for the Labour Party, again, this division of left and right has been broken down, but Labour now faces a schism. We've seen the membership vote strongly to leave the European Union, in contrast to its leadership and a lot of its parliamentary representatives. And I think that lesson is one that the Conservatives can learn. And what I think that takes me to is that for individuals, I hope that this signals a renaissance in civic participation and devolution of power and activity by individuals. It does show how important and significant membership of a political party is. And I hope that by showing that people can make a difference through their vote, through registering, through having a say in who is leading their party, that actually this may well renew interest in what's hitherto been seen as quite an esoteric activity or something which is irrelevant or detached or doesn't make a difference. I hope that this is a new generation of people who do take back control literally and say, well, I want to have a say about who's running the country and who's making a decision on my behalf.
Thank you very much. Just before we open it up for everybody, I would be quite interested to explore this conflict between the values analysis and the social class analysis. I mean, it does seem on the face of it that almost 2/3 of Ds and C2s voted leave, and nearly 60% of ABs voted to remain. There's a huge class element to it. And I can't believe that all of those C2s and Ds are, whippers and floggers. Indeed, I mean, I think this is one of the elements that's missing in this analysis is that what we've experienced, or what many people feel they've experienced in the last generation or so, is a kind of liberal overreach that they are reacting to, that there is a kind of legitimate, almost one might say, it's not too oxymoronic, a kind of liberal populist reaction against the liberal overreach in European integration and immigration, whatever. And that there is actually a kind of sort of sensible, relatively liberal centre of people who have decided to vote leave because they think that the people governing us, the rules of the system have moved too far in a liberal direction. They are not authoritarians. Right.
My response to that is I agree, but I think that it's the rise in diversity, the rise in ethnic diversity, which has brought out this division more sharply. So somebody who doesn't like change, who likes stability and order, is going to be more affected by a society that becomes more diverse. And someone who enjoys change, wants novelty and stimulation, is going to actually move in a different direction. And if you look at the US, for example, you can see that as you get a larger and larger share of Hispanics in your county, the gap between Republicans and Democrats and immigration is wider and wider. So you're getting the diversity is leading to this polarization. So I'd say the stimulus has been the diversity, but essentially people...
That may be true, but I mean, that's a different argument. So that's, you can feel a little bit uneasy about rapid ethnic change, and be quite liberal. I mean, your values argument is a different one. Did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, there is an interesting question about this referendum, which is how do you basically explain the extra 25% of the leave vote that wasn't from what you might consider to be a kind of UKIP hard Eurosceptic element. And so that extra 20% could be who you're referring to as sort of concerned liberals. It could be a kind of more sort of free market type critique of the EU, the sort of Daniel Hannan type argument. But the majority of the leave vote was, without any doubt, was coming from voters who, I mean, just look, for example, at the 20 local authorities that gave the strongest support to leave. I mean, the average income in those authorities, the median income was around £18,000. Overall average levels of education were very low. Percentage of professional workers was below average, very white, struggling. And I am saying
they were Labour as well, were they?
No, they weren't. I mean, lots of Conservative areas as well. But the place where I struggle with the argument that this is about personality is that surely then everybody with those personality characteristics is concentrating in the same area, which I struggle to
I just quickly, or
well,
let's
probably haven't got Mark at the back.
Yeah, as somebody who voted for Brexit but is against coercive whipping, I'd like to make sort of two I know, very bourgeois. Two proof points. The first was about the age factor. And what is interesting, if you look at other European countries that have had referendums, I remember that there was a massive vote against the EU very recently in Holland, also Denmark, 10 years ago in France and Holland. The youngest cohorts voted overwhelmingly against the EU, and it seems only in Britain that the Eurosceptics have this problem. And I would suggest that is partly a legacy of Farage and the way in which UKIP have waged a weird kind of culture war and have not built a sufficiently broad cultural coalition against the EU, which has put off, I think, particularly an element of young middle class people. The second point I very briefly want to make is I totally disagree with this liberal versus authoritarian dichotomy, and it seems to me this is just yet another manifestation of the way in which an element of the middle classes in this country are turning on the working classes, much as it occurred at the time of the Great Reform Act. So the working classes are being collectively labelled as authoritarians, when in fact if you look at the opinion poll data I've seen, a very large percentage of people who voted against the EU because they believed in democratic values. And in fact associated the EU not with liberal values, because it's by definition not a liberal system of government, it's not a democratic system of government. So this kind of crude dichotomy, I think needs to go. I think there are coalitions on both sides, and I'm not saying you can't be a liberal and pro the EU, but equally you can be a liberal and against the EU, and I don't think this crude dichotomy works.
So, yeah, Brexit is the last great act of the English working class. And chartism to Brexit. That's interesting.
Very quick comment.
We'll just take a few questions.
Very quick comment. I think the young vote in Europe against the EU is more to do with dysfunctional labour markets. It's a way that lots of young people are essentially locked out of employment. And when you get 30–40% unemployment in Spain and Italy among young people, and they associate the system with the EU, they become a natural protest vote.
You always have 40% youth unemployment in Spain. I mean, it's for as long as I can remember. I mean, it's just sort of part of the system in Spain. I mean, it's not even really part of the European lady.
Yes, just to explore the youth vote in the UK a little bit further. Do we have any ideas about, or any information about why the young in this country voted overwhelmingly for Remain? I mean, I've got one or two ideas. They're conservative with a small c. They don't like change, and they've only ever been used to being in the EU. In other words, you have to be 55 at least to actually have any grown-up knowledge of being outside the EU. I don't know if it's got anything to do with it or whether you've got any data.
The guy at the front, the lobby chair.
And Tony Hopley from the LSE. Just another hypothesis to put forward. Bobby didn't present one of the correlations that's fascinated me in the past few days, which was between owning a passport and intention to vote Leave or Remain, which then set me thinking that maybe we're talking about static populations and mobile populations, and there's a large chunk of the country that's very static, has very strong social identity, both in rural England and in the provincial towns, who don't dream of moving. Their social identity is where they live. And we haven't, in social policy, really talked to those people. I don't think, particularly in conservative policy, it's all about opportunity, basically opportunity to leave your identity, to go elsewhere, Dick Whittington-wise, and earn your fortune, travel the world, etc. And if policy doesn't speak to the static populations, they feel threatened by rapid change. They don't feel that they have control of the world that they love that's around them, which is different to someone who's very mobile. So I wonder if there is a mobility element to explain these conundrums in what we're seeing.
Perhaps one more, and then we can have a guy front here. And then you get a chance to spare.
William Sandman. One of the interesting things is whenever I've been to political meetings of the party that I belong to, it's always been those of us who are immigrants who have been very, very conscious of the very destructive effects of the multicultural programme that has been set in place for the last 40 years. I think we're now living with the consequences that not allowing some degree of ethnocentricity, having equalities legislation saying that all cultures are equal. My family came here and were grateful not to have been burnt in an oven, and were very respectful of the fact that we'd come to this country and respected the culture that we had come to. Did not expect them to become like us. We adapted to some degree and kept our own culture at the same time. And I think there's been a massive failing by the extreme liberalism that is not prepared to accept that people have to be secure in their own culture to accept incomes. And I think we've destroyed that by having positions taken. If I listen to some of the QC speaking, who I know, and I think they live in a different world. They don't live in the reality of people's day-to-day lives. And I just wonder how the panel thinks we can reverse that to give people back the security of being who they are, and then being more generous.
Just a quick response from people up here, just to answer the questions that are relevant or interesting.
Sure. So, from a young people point of view, because that's probably where we've spent most of our time looking at a generational analysis across Europe, actually, looking at a whole range of different attitudes and values, looking at cohorts, not just young people. The good thing is you've got data that goes back all the way to the 1970s from Eurobarometer analysis, so you can actually see what has changed and what has always been the same for young people. And you're absolutely right that Britain stands out in terms of young people's views being different and more open than most other European countries do, to a greater extent. It's not quite the case that that young people are more sceptical in all the different countries, though more or less it's in line is the usual kind of pattern that we see, particularly in Greece and the southern states, so there kind of no generational difference, and there's a lot to do with post-war experience, you can imagine, that it's kind of the gratitude of Europe sorting stuff out, and it kind of comes in line. So we do stand out. We do have a different kind of view, and why that is going to your point. I'm sure it's because it's a value and attitude that seems to be sticking with people. That points to something that was important when your cultural norms were set. So your point about that's what they've known, that's what they've grown up with, I'm sure is important. But you can see going to the open-closed dichotomy. You can see it across all sorts of attitudes among that young cohort being very different in their views of immigration in Britain compared to other young people in other countries within Europe. We're just a massive difference between Britain in terms of the youngest generation versus the oldest generation being much less concerned about immigration still, even now, than the young generation in other countries. So there is something distinct about Britain and this particular young cohort. That's to do with a more open attitude, and whether that's, if you took Jeremy Cliff's view about Britain's cosmopolitan future, which looks less correct now, but there are some fundamental points in there about increasing number of graduates, increasing number of contact between people from different cultures, all of those types of things are creating that more open sense. And we do need to not lose sight of that for the future in the next few years. You're going to see that as a really important trend about that.
You might not see that if they continue to turn out at much lower levels than other generations. I mean, one of the remarkable things for me looking at the petition to have a second referendum was that the number of signatures was highest in areas that had the lowest turnout. But the actual referendum, Camden and Hackney being two in the top five, and I do look at the generation, or the millennial generation, and you look at the BES data on turnout, and they're not engaging anywhere near the extent to which they should be.
Yeah, absolutely, a massive democratic deficit. So when you look at the proportion of the population, 65 plus seem to make up 22% of the population, but 29% of the voting Republican. It's exactly the reverse for the millennial group. They make up 29% of the population, but 22% of the voting. So it's a massive deficit.
And there is an important point actually, because just prior to the referendum, we had this big debate, particularly on social media, about what would be more important to turn out. Would this vote at the referendum be driven by age? Would it be driven by class? What's really interesting now looking at the results is you see very high levels of turnout in some of the areas that have been the most economically disadvantaged over the years, right? Where you've got really high turnout. It's almost as if that economically disaffected group just took this one chance that they had to turn out at quite high levels over, well over the average.
I think, to be honest, that is the story of the referendum in some ways. It was an extra 2-point-something million voters if you're looking at that compared to the election, and it was overwhelmingly from those types of groups and not from other groups that you might have said.
Surely these young people are going to change their views. I mean, what they express is a kind of sort of shallow liberalism of kind of youth culture.
No.
And as soon as they actually get a job and settle down, then they will actually change.
No, I don't think so. Not in some terms, yes, absolutely. So you have period effects where everyone changes, life cycle effects where people change as they age, and then you do have cohort effects where people are socialised in a different way and they keep those values for longer throughout their lives. And that's the value of looking at these things as cohorts and not age groups, is you can actually track that these are different and staying different. And just to be clear, it's still only 40-odd% of young people who say they trust the European Union. It's not all young people, but it's just at a much higher rate than the rest. This is not saying that this cohort is uniform.
I'm not 100% convinced. I mean, I remember when the young voters were all Quebec nationalists, and that was projected to be the inevitable.
Yeah, but how always think you want to.
Anyway, I'll reply to. Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to. By the way, I think this idea about personality and authoritarianism. I mean, you still saw that amongst hardcore supporters of capital punishment, still 30% of them were favorable to the EU. So it's not everybody, and I'm not making that point, but I am suggesting amongst the factors that predict whether somebody is going to go for leave or not, that is the most important one. Now, in terms of the maps in class, I don't doubt that it's got some importance, but in the data for BES, if you look at working class, middle class, there's a 15-point gap. But that still means that 40% of middle class are for leave, and there's a significant chunk of the working class that is for remain. And it's just not as powerful a differentiator as value. So I'm not saying it's not important. And if you look, and maps are very highly misleading in my view, because a lot of the things that differ across space between districts are the demographics. But if you look within, in terms of individual to individual, it's within district variation that is more important. So I would argue, but I very much agree with your point, by the way, that I think the big question is not what does it mean to be British, let's say, but what does it mean to be white British in the future as society gets more diverse? That's really the question that has to be addressed. Absolutely the question, not what does it mean to be British.
So Suella, do you want to come back?
Yes, on this point about multiculturalism, I think that it does throw up this question of what it is to be British, and also looking at the ethnic minority breakdown as well. There was a significant proportion of people people of ethnic minority or black or Asian voting to leave the European Union. So I think it's not right to say that they would necessarily be motivated by immigration, although immigration would have been a key factor. The majority of people voting to leave would have been motivated by democracy and sovereignty, as the gentleman at the back was saying. I think it was only 30% of people said that immigration was the main reason. The majority of people said that democracy and sovereignty and control was actually the motivating factor. And I think that, an interesting emergence is this breakdown of the ethnic minority vote, and I don't think that was anticipated. Again, whether that's drawn along class and income lines and whether it's more just related to geography, that may well be the case, or whether it is actually something about personality and values, about someone who comes to this country from another country and sets up their life, and that actually, by definition, that person has a different kind of personality, making them more prone to leave and in favour of whipping and corporal punishment. I don't really know.
I think I'm right in saying that the more successful groups, British Indians, British Chinese, tended to be more Brexit, actually, and less successful groups tended to be more Remain. But so should we take a quick final round, because time is moving on. Two people at the front. Make them quick.
I'm just interested in personality, because is there evidence, it's correlation, but where's the evidence for the causation?
Okay.
The search for identity and allegiance goes much wider than the socially conservative. The problem for Europe is that it structurally cannot provide this, and that's why even the most fervent Remain advocate didn't seriously try to sell the EU as something which people would give their allegiance to. That is a problem which they cannot overcome. So the huge advantage of the nation-state, self-governing society over the EU is structural and will not be cured. The only other comment is that the left in this country is more or less giving up on economics, and that will go into the politics of gender and race and sexuality, which have no resonance amongst the socially conservative. So to that extent, I think there is a correlation, but the big problem is the search for identity, and I think that remains unresolved.
Just a couple more, two gentlemen.
Personally, I believe in flagging, but I believe in Remain. just kidding. But I'm very interested in this 1.5% of people are dying, and the old people basically voted Brexit, and young people. So if you extrapolated that, how long would it take for the young people to prevail? If you ignore the, well, if you also factored in the fact that young people vote less. Because it seemed to me old people are set on young people. I mean, my kids all voted to Remain, as did I. I think that what they want is the ability to know that they can live and work freely in Europe without hassle, without, which is what they've done and studied. And I think they feel that, and one of them's there now, they feel that this is going to be a constraint on them in future in terms of opportunity. I'm just speaking for my children, but I'm interested in, what are we talking about, 3 years or 5 years?
I think they're all about that. I mean, we'll have visa-free travel. They may have to have a work permit.
We don't know. We don't know about any of it. Well, this is a leap in the darkness.
We can quite confidently predict that. The only difference
we
will have to have a work permit.
My business is not investing in the UK. We put a moratorium on investment in the UK until we figure out what the deal is. So I urge every MP that thinks about this to do whatever they're going to do it quickly.
Right. Okay. Go in front of you.
I was fascinated by the authoritarian idea, not least because my perception is exactly the opposite. And an interesting point on the demographics, it seems that the cohort on the red line, the young cohort, is precisely delineated by people who were born after Margaret Thatcher was elected. They've grown up in a non-authoritarian economic environment, which has nonetheless benefited from being able to sell its goods and services into the EU. So my perception is precisely the opposite to yours, Professor, with the greatest possible respect.
Yeah, I've got three quick questions. First of all, to what extent do you think that there's a difference in alienation between Westminster and the devolved territories in terms of the public being unhappy? The next one is, to what extent, looking at the results of the last general election, could you go through places and say, actually, I think there's a fair chance that there'll be trouble there in this upcoming referendum, like my hometown Plymouth, that would be a good lead suggestion that there's going to be trouble to come. The other thing which I'm quite intrigued by is that the high turnout from alienated Labour voters. One of the things I noticed when I didn't do very much canvassing this event, but I was struck by no one felt I was on the door about to get something out of it. There were no candidates who were going to win. So if you are a hacked off elector who thinks they're all in it for the money, you are not going to hold back, because no one's going to, in that sense, get anything out of it. And I wonder if that played any part in electoral turnout.
Gentlemen, no, you already had a go. I mean, you can perhaps
just really to support what the gentleman over there said. I mean, I do think that the historical experience of Europe has been undervalued by the panel in an attempt to explain one vote which happened last week, rather than a series of incidents over time which explain people's experience of the European Union as they've grown, as things have happened. Whether it's the referendum itself back in '75, whether it's Nigel Farage who said it was the creation of the Single European Act that Cummings did that actually made him narrative, whether it was the Maastricht vote, whether it was the Euro campaign, whether it was even the opening of world trade with China coming on rather than just sort of traditional Western Eastern Europe divide. But all of those issues are important, and you can say that immigration is the top bit, but it's certainly not the whole lot.
Just to lady there, and it's very, very short from you, and then just go half a minute from everybody else here.
Thanks very much. I'd be interested to hear a comment from the panel on that other aspect of the debate before the referendum, that was the dismissal of expertise. A kind of setting up of common sense against what the experts say discussion, and what that might predict or say about the tone and level of public discourse in this country in the future.
Very quick second go from the gentleman in the blue shirt.
So I just wonder, do you think the shock of losing the referendum will change young people's engagement in politics longer term?
Okay, just everybody a minute to reply to what you want to reply to.
Yeah. So young people, then again, I think so yeah, the thing about the vote is it's obviously very close. So the shift in populations that you would need in order to switch it over to a majority view from that kind of generational replacement point of view is not very long. So we could still be negotiating our way out of this, and actually just through nothing else changing, but through demographic replacement of these things, the view, if taken again in the same circumstances, would be different because of that. Because people are dying and being replaced by people that have got such different views. So in our figures, it's 71% for Remain to twice the level of Remain among the 65 pluses among that group that's growing into voting age now. So that is a significant issue for the balance of it. I think the point about the Margaret Thatcher growing up in that circumstance, I think that possibly that the massive changes in how young people live today, driven by technology and connection to the rest of the world, that is the key driving factor in openness and connection, and having a different view of identity that's broader than local area, nation state, and all those other types of things. So there's those, look at the big trends. The big trends are economic and technological for those groups, and so they're the things that are driving that very different worldview.
Yeah, no, I mean, just back to the authoritarianism issue, and again, I think that's a very unfortunate word. I think it's about people who prefer stability and order, and I think that's, in a way, a poor choice of word, and I need to sort of tag with it. But the other thing, I think, just to focus on this whole question of authoritarianism, is if you look at the Brexit side, there are really two components. There's one that is a more libertarian, sovereignty-oriented, political, nationalist component, which I think is represented by, figures such as maybe Theresa May, maybe Boris Johnson, etc. Maybe a more elite kind of libertarian rationale. And then there is, I think, the motivations of the mass of the vote, which I think are motivated more by identity, immigration. And that is more closely connected to not wanting these big changes in your life. I think the word authoritarian is a red herring. It's about simply being not oriented to change, oriented to stability, continuity. So that's what I'd say.
It was you that used the word.
Well, I only
use another one.
I only use it because that's the academic terminology, which I don't like the word, and it's not a value judgment. I have to get it.
So over the weekend I was reading David Putnam's book on the 1975 referendum, which is a really brilliant book and worth rereading. And David made a point in the introduction where he was reflecting on the results and said that even though the Brits had voted by a healthy margin to stay in the European community, there had been no girding of the loins when it came to public enthusiasm for the EU. And in a way, that sort of set the stage for the British response to the EU over the 4 decades that followed. And you could see it consistently in every survey. We were always less enthusiastic than our neighbours about EU membership. And so, I'm not at all dismissing the importance of that longer-term experience with Europe, and that socialisation experience, going through Maastricht, then going through free movement, you know, and going through all of those debates is very important. And it just makes me, it sort of makes me wonder about, you know, the importance of the referendum itself, because we know from research that expressive voting is far more prominent at referendums. You know, when voters go into the ballot box under first past the post, they're making a strategic calculation. But we know from the research on referendums elsewhere in Europe that when voters go into the polling booth of referendums and they're free of the electoral system, they make a truly expressive, a truly sincere vote. And they don't just think about tactics and who's going to win this constituency. And that's where I think this referendum takes on a new level of importance, because it has delivered a very unequivocal vote. And this is what Remainers, I do think, actually forget. This was not a close vote. In England, this was a 7-point difference. I mean, if you looked, as my colleague Chris Andretti has done, going back to your point about the constituencies, he's now calculated the local authority vote shares to constituency level and found that Brexit was a majority view of 521 seats. You know, I mean, this is a real sort of landslide for one side. And that in turn is going to impact on how we navigate through 2020 and beyond, because you now have a large number of MPs who are not connected as such with that local popular view. And that will carry on, you know, in all manner of ways. I was running the numbers last night. There are 6 cabinet ministers who are now out of touch with their local view. You're in touch, but lots of your colleagues, unfortunately, are now out of touch, including Matthew Goodwin.
Just point the way through the cloudy future as well.
Well, I think looking at our history and the history of our relationship with the EU, it's actually astonishing that we were a member for such a long time. You know, we had troubled entry, and British exceptionalism has always been part of the psyche of this country, which has always tainted and made our relationship difficult. And as you say, Andrew, there's been a chronicle of troubles leading up to our exit now. So actually, I think that we are returning to our instinctive and more kind of honest way of being as a country, actually. In Parliament, the Brexit and the Remainer MPs were divided as the romantics and the pragmatists, and the Brexiteers being the romantics. And I'm quite glad I'm in that camp. And I think it probably is a yearning for libertarianism, a purist kind of view of how people should be in charge of their own destiny, devolution of power, the small, the bespoke, the digital, which is really at odds with what is looking more and more like an anachronistic institution that is the EU. So I think this has been a vote against the establishment, it's been against big institutions, and it's been about the small man against government and protest.
Hear, hear.
Although didn't 1066 and all that have it's romantic but wrong and right? Anyway, thank you all very much, and can we just say thank you.